something that exists. Like, you can work extremely hard and not make it to the top. And I think people really know this, like, in their guts, but because, like, of this American exceptionalism and the individualism that really is so gooey, like, it's just this glue that binds all of us individuals in America. Like, we all, like, think that we have to work so hard all of the time. I, for one, if I'm not working hard, if I'm not being productive, I feel so bad about myself. I forget it's okay to take rest days, right?
Right.
So, like, all of that kind of, like, just like comes crashing down on everyone's shoulders at some point. And now it's caused this explosion of, this discussion on critical race theory. But meritocracy really is, I'm going to say, it's bullshit.
Oh, no, it is. It is.
I was trying to get something so, like, so so intellectual, but then at the end of the day, all I can say is it's bullshit.
No, and it's, yeah, that's the thing. It's not true. It's realizing that, for some people, whether you're a woman, whether you're a person of color, whether you're an immigrant, you don't have the same opportunities. Whether you're someone who comes from a lower socioeconomic status, you don't have the same opportunities. And with that, I did want to say earlier is that, when we're talking about making people feel bad and whatever, like, it's not going to feel good. And I think I had this quote in the training that I did from the book, So You Want to Talk About Race. She says in her book that it doesn't feel good to recognize your privilege, right? Like, it's not going to be like this amazing thing and it's going to be awesome. Like, no, you're going to feel kind of crappy about it, but we're not saying that you need to feel bad about it, Like, yeah, it kind of does hurt to realize that if you don't work hard, you don't get the same things as me. Like, that makes people sad. Like, I would like to think that, you know what I mean? But it's not the truth. And that can be really hard to accept. And, realizing that is sad. But it's the reality of it. It's not like it's going to be uncomfortable, but we're not asking you to take responsibility. You just kind of feel bad for a little bit.
Yeah, that's really well said. You're so good at explaining these in such a, like, calm way. Like, you saw me, I just was, like, freaking out. I'm like, I can't stand this idea.
Yeah.
Because I think it's destructive, really. And I think it has hurt so many people. I mean, not even just throughout history, but, like, today, it is constantly hurting people that have the American dream right in their head and think that if they work just that extra bit harder, maybe they can make it. Maybe they can get, the extra dime, the extra nickel to be in a comfortable place. But that, like, constant longing is really dangerous, because it kind of puts you in this position where you will be susceptible to subservience in a way. Like, I'm going to work, like, I worked at a grocery store. I'm going to work extra hard at this grocery store to earn all this cash, maybe rise through the ranks. And then, I'll use that cash and I'll invest in something, right? Like, we have this long-term goal, but then, like, I've wasted so much of my life, like, working extra hard, wasted so much of my emotional capacity working that hard, that, like, I have forgotten to, like, be there for my family. I have forgotten to take care of my mental health, which is extremely important to actually succeeding in the things that you want to do, right? And so this individualism, this meritocracy idea has created these egos, this cultural ego that Americans have. And we do kind of spend most of our days just slaving away at work, thinking that maybe one day it'll be, we'll just be comfortable enough. And it's never going to be enough. It really won't, because I am so much closer to a homeless person than I ever will be to, like, Jeff Bezos and all of this kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sort of like, tangenting here, but, like, it's, when we're talking about economic issues within this country, it really is mixed in with the race issue.
Yeah. It drives racism. These ideas that you're talking about, and the lack of acknowledging it drives racism. And that's why we have it in our institutions and within our systems.
Mm-hmm.
It drives it.
Yeah. I like to use the line that if we we had perfect sort of like pure legislation that has no racism in it, like explicit racism in it, and every individual was perfectly pure, no racist bone in their body, like we would still have these disparate outcomes that create unequal effects for each demographic. And when we, eventually we'll talk a little bit more about intersectionality at some point, I'm sure, because it's so important. You see how these systems that have been in place for hundreds of years create these disparate outcomes, even if they aren't explicitly racist. That's like one of the hardest parts, is like people say, oh, we're not a racist country. Point to me where the racism is. And it's like, now I have to give you a 2-hour lecture on how we are systemically racist, because it's like, we don't have like Jim Crow legislation anymore that is obviously racist. We have legislation that is still here that is, if you look at it very closely,
it's racist, but it's sugar coated.
Yes, sugar coated is a perfect way of saying it. It's so hard to see it and be like, okay, well, what are the consequences of this legislation, rather than like, what's the wording, right? And I think one of the consequences of the legislation that we've been talking about, I just got to Iowa. I have so many more. I have examples from so many other states, but I think Iowa was a good example because I think it touched on all of it, right? Mm-hmm. But this type of legislation, even if like it doesn't, even if there are loopholes and educators and schools can kind of get around it, and no individual teacher is like sent to jail for stuff like this, you're still going to see consequences of teachers being a little bit more cautious, like I keep saying. And so that's where we need to look, is what are the consequences? What are the disparate outcomes that will come about if such legislation is put in place?
Right. And these legislations, they are racist, but because we don't acknowledge it, it's so hard for us to actually see it for what it is, because we're so used to just the way that things are, that, you know what I mean? Like the wording, like it doesn't specifically say people of color cannot do this, and this, but, whether it's, voting booths will only be provided in these 2 wealthy, primarily white districts, and everybody else who is around it, we're not going to provide transportation for those people. Oh, surprise, they're all mainly people of color. Like, we don't think, oh, that's racist, but it is, because the placement and the wording of whatever that legislation is disproportionately affecting people of color, or whatever it may be. And it's so hard for us to see that, because I personally think that, we live in a racist society, and we all grow up in kind of embedded into this racism and American idealism, and that we don't see it, it's like you have to really look closely, because that's just what we were taught was always right.
Yeah, it's really a difficult issue, because like I agree with you so much when you say like we live in a racist society, but then if you say that to someone that hasn't gone through the fog, if you will, the fog that we're all kind of born with and taught, not born with, what that we're taught in this country, it's hard to, like, you have to really walk them through it. You can't just say, I think this is really where activism comes into play, and it's so important to be really meticulous with your activism, is you have to guide them in a sense. Like, we can't teach everybody, right? Like, obviously education is under attack, but like, as far as activism goes, just screaming this country is a racist country, I don't think is going to, I think it will do good in the sense that, see, I'm really conflicted internally here, because I want to scream on the rooftop, but
it's sharp words. And I think when I was reading the book How to Be Anti-Racist, which I haven't finished yet, but oh my gosh, what's his name? Hold on, let me.
Ibram X. Kendi.
Yes, Ibram said, he kind of starts the book off talking about, racism and the word racism, and he's like, the reason why we think that racism is such a sharp word, and saying like we live in a racist society, is because it's not normalized. It's one of those things where it's so like, oh my gosh, shocking to say, and it's just not normalized. And that's why people, again, because we don't talk about it, people take such offense to it. So when we say like this society is racist, it's like, whoa, like, But then at the same time, when you're trying to communicate with somebody, it's just going to shut them down, which is unfortunate because we don't talk about it enough and it's not normalized enough.
Yeah, that the word is a trigger for many people. And I've found in conversations that I've had that you have to be strategic in how you discuss racism. And like how I mentioned, racism and economic issues go hand in hand. You almost have to be hyper specific about what is happening without talking about race, and then people might be on board with it. Like I've had discussions with fervent conservatives who would never, I mean, like they hear the word socialism and they freak out, right? But like you start saying stuff like, well, I think, in a workplace, maybe we should vote on salaries and pay differences, right? Like, and maybe at the end of the year, the Christmas bonus check, maybe that should be distributed a little bit more equally than just going to the CEO. And then conservatives are like, hell yeah. A lot of the times, not everyone, but I've had plenty of discussions and it has went like this. But then, you say, so how do we get there? How do we get to that place? Since we agree that, there should be a little bit more democracy within a workplace. And then you say, you get like, you almost get to like a wall and you go, socialism. You have to like anti-capitalism, and then it's like no, like then they freak out, right? And I use the term team colors a lot. Like I'll agree with conservatives in my family a lot on things, and it comes from a place of empathy. Our discussion it does, but then the team colors come into play, and so the Democrats, the Republicans, and that all gets like muddy and in the wash, and so like you can't get through them once they have found out what is being talked about, like, and they kind of, their brain gets triggered and sent back to that, like that Fox News guys, that like smoke cloud, and they just go like, oh, Democrats bad, like socialism bad, right? Like it's racism, like I'm not racist.
Yeah, it's like the white fragility coming into play. It's like, like, and that's why people are freaking out about critical race theory. Like, I mean, even, the word critical race theory, they hear the word race and it's like, oh my gosh, what the hell is this? I don't, and
it's like a loaded word. It has a punch to it a little bit.
Yeah, but that's the point. We're critically analyzing race and applying it as a theory.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I don't know. And that's the thing. That's why they freak out so much, because you hear that like, oh, we're going to be talking about race in the classroom. I don't want my child to be exposed to that. And it's like, because they get so triggered by it.
Yeah. So I think going along with this discussion of power and oppression, sort of leading into now more specifics on what does power and oppression look like in America. Well, it looks like race. It looks like, and I've talked a lot about economics at the end of our discussion here. And we've talked about education and how, right, educators might be more cautious after this legislation is implemented. I think that sort of wraps up everything that we sort of need to talk about. Maybe we can do a little bit of like closing remarks. But going from here, I think talking more about those disparate outcomes and that legislation that will create those disparate outcomes. I think the next topic should be something like maybe the voting rights that are sort of under attack. Like I know there's been legislation at the federal level to try to combat that. And I know a lot of southern states especially have voting rights or voting legislation that makes it harder, like you mentioned, where the polls are actually at, like geographically, like that matters, right? Depending on who can get there, like the access. So it doesn't have to be voting rights, but I think we should think about that. I think any listeners should think about that. Think about the laws that are in your state that might be affecting race relations in your area, that might be creating. What'd you say?
And your child's education.
Especially your child's education, absolutely, or your education. So Any closing remarks for me, Jamila?